That's the law. The law is that if a country prevents humanitarian assistance coming to these starving children, it is violating the law. It could not be clearer than it is. And I think very few people doubt that Israel is in violation of that law.
A law written in plain English, a violation happening in plain sight, and the people sworn to enforce it, looking the other way. Watch what happens when someone finally reads the law out loud.
Israel's interference in U.S. humanitarian operations is in clear violation of Section 6201 of the Foreign Assistance Act. And that law and its language could not be clearer. So I want everybody to hear what the law says. Quote, "No assistance shall be furnished to any country when it is made known to the President that the government of such country prohibits or otherwise restricts, directly or indirectly, the transport or delivery of United States."
This is the moment the speech becomes something heavier than rhetoric. A sitting senator has just read federal law into the congressional record, not paraphrased it, not summarized it, read it word for word. That is a deliberate act. When a legislator reads the statute aloud on the Senate floor, they are creating an undeniable paper trail. They are forcing the question into the official record where it cannot be quietly buried. The law does not have exceptions written in for allies. It does not have a carve-out for geopolitical complexity. It says what it says. So the real question is not whether a violation is occurring. Drop it in the comments. Why do you think the law is not being enforced here?
Humanitarian assistance, end quote. That's the law. The law is that if a country prevents humanitarian assistance coming to these starving children, it is violating the law. It could not be clearer than it is. And I think very few people doubt that Israel is in violation of that law. Yet the administration and the Congress do nothing. The State Department doesn't even pretend to apply the Leahy Law to Israel, refusing to properly track U.S. arms or even identify which Israeli units receive U.S. security assistance, a basic requirement of the law and a standard applied to every other country. Madam President, as I go around Vermont and around the country, it is my strong feeling that the American people are increasingly disgusted by the destruction of Gaza and the unbelievable misery that is befalling the Palestinian people who are there. And the American people want it to end.
What you just watched was not a speech, it was a legal indictment delivered from the Senate floor, and almost nobody covered it that way. A senator stood up, opened a statute, and read it aloud. Word for word, no spin, no interpretation. The law says that if a country blocks United States humanitarian assistance, American aid to that country must stop. Full stop. That is not a talking point, that is the text of Section 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act. It has been sitting there enforceable for years, and yet here we are. The State Department is not tracking the arms properly. The specific Israeli military units receiving American security assistance have not been formally identified, which is a basic legal requirement applied to every other recipient country on earth, every other one. This is not a gray area buried in legal footnotes. This is a standard procedure that has simply not been followed, and nobody in a position of authority is being asked to explain why. But here is what nobody is saying out loud. The fact that this law exists and is being openly ignored is not a bureaucratic failure. Bureaucracies do not selectively forget paperwork for ally nations by accident. This is a policy choice. Someone decided that enforcing this law against this particular country was not something the administration was willing to do, and that decision was made quietly, without a vote, without a public statement, and without any accountability mechanism being triggered. Think about what that actually means. It means the legal architecture designed to give Congress oversight of foreign military aid, oversight that was written into law specifically because of past abuses, has been rendered functionally decorative. The law is there. The violation is there. The enforcement is not. Why now? That is the question worth sitting with. This speech did not happen in a vacuum. The senator explicitly said that going around Vermont, going around the country, the American people are increasingly disgusted. That is a politician reading the room. That is someone who has been in enough town halls, enough conversations, enough constituent meetings to know that the political ground has shifted beneath this issue. The public sentiment has moved, and when public sentiment moves far enough, politicians who are quiet start finding their voice, not always out of moral clarity, but because the calculation has changed. That does not make the argument wrong. The argument stands on its own. But it is worth understanding that what you are watching is also a political signal, a very deliberate one. Now here is where the honest analysis has to hold two things at once. Supporters of continued aid argue that the situation is more complex than a single statute allows for. That cutting aid mid-conflict to a close security partner carries consequences that extend far beyond Gaza, into regional stability, into deterrence calculations, into decades of alliance architecture. They argue that blunt legislative tools are not designed for the surgical precision that a live conflict requires. These are not dishonest arguments. They are the arguments that have kept this policy in place across multiple administrations of both parties. Critics, and the senator's speech sits firmly in this camp, argue that complexity has become a permanent excuse, that every time the law gets close to being applied, the complexity argument appears to make it disappear again. That starving children do not become less starving because the geopolitics are complicated, and that a law which only gets enforced against countries that lack powerful lobbying infrastructure is not really a law. It is a suggestion with selective teeth. What both camps are missing is the institutional erosion underneath all of it. Every time a binding statute is visibly ignored without consequence, the enforceability of every other statute weakens slightly. This is not abstract. Congress's power over foreign policy has been contracting for decades. War powers, arms sales, aid conditions, and each unenforced law is another brick removed from the foundation. The senator reading that statute aloud was not just making a moral argument. Whether intentionally or not, that speech was a document of institutional decay, a record of a law that exists, a violation that is acknowledged, and a system that has decided, collectively, quietly, to do nothing about it. Historical parallels are not hard to find. There have been other moments where American foreign assistance law ran directly into the reality of what an ally was doing, and where the enforcement mechanism was quietly set aside. Each time the justification was strategic necessity. Each time the precedent made the next exception easier to grant. The pattern is not new. What is new is how openly it is now playing out, on the Senate floor, in plain language, with the statutory text in hand. If this is the kind of analysis you are not finding in your regular feed, you already know what to do. The final line of this speech is the one that will not make the highlight packages. Not the legal citation, not the indictment of the administration. The final line was this: the American people want it to end. That is not a policy prescription. It is a political warning. It is a senator telling the chamber, and anyone watching, that the space between what the public wants and what the government is doing has grown wide enough to become a liability. How wide it has to grow before anything changes is the question this story leaves open. And it is not close to finished. If you made it this far, share this with one person who thinks this kind of analysis does not exist anymore. Subscribe, drop your take in the comments, and if you think the law should be enforced or if you think the complexity argument holds, say so. Both sides deserve to be heard. That conversation is exactly what this channel is here for.